Good morning from California. My name is David Amadia. I'm the president of Ridge Vineyards, and it'll be my pleasure to host today's tasting. We're coming to you live today from the Montebello tasting room here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Welcome to everyone to Ridge's Fall 2020 virtual tasting. We've been conducting these virtual tastings for 8 years now. In pro-COVID times, I think the four of us would be shoulder to shoulder somewhere in a vineyard, either at Linton Springs or at Montebello, but these are different times and we're all in different locations and we're coming to you live via Zoom. With this, we did this in April as well. Our last virtual tasting happened just a few weeks after a lot of us went into mandatory lockdown, and we did the tasting via Zoom and quite successfully, but I think all of us had a hard time imagining that 6 months later we'd still be in a very similar situation, but here we are. So anyway, our best to everyone out there, and hopefully you and your family are all healthy. Let's see, we will be tasting our fall releases today, and we hope that many of you have been able to get your hands on some samples and have them poured out in front of you. The 5 wines that we'll be tasting today in tasting order will be the 2019 Grenache Blanc. Second will be the 2018 Pagani Zinfandel. Third in the lineup, 2018 Lytton Springs. Then the Lytton Estate Petite Syrah, and then the 5th wine will be the 2017 Montebello. So a little Zoom housekeeping for you. Feel free to check in with us on social media, #RidgeVirtual, on Instagram, Facebook, whatever your pleasure. We'd be happy to see what's going on in your world as we go through the tasting. Let's see, use the Q&A function to ask questions of the panelists. So that's the best method to ask questions on, and we will field as many questions as possible today through the Q&A function. And if you just want to chat, let us know what's going on, say hi to other people on the tasting, feel free to use the chat function, and we will have Ridge personnel they will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat and passing through questions. Let me introduce our panel. To my, in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, in the Brady Bunch lineup here is David Gates. David is our head of vineyard operations and has been with Ridge for 31 years. And we're happy to have David with us today. In the upper right-hand corner is Eric Baugher. Eric is our winemaker, COO of the Montebello winery. And Eric's been with Ridge for 26 years. And in the lower left corner is John Olney, our COO at Linton Springs and winemaker. And John's been with Ridge for 24 years. So I think that's more than 80 years of collective experience all between the four of us. So I think we're in good shape. So I think, let's see, we're going to give you an update on the wildfires in the 2020 vintage, but a quick update on COVID. The great news here at Ridge is that we have 0 confirmed cases amongst all of our employees. So we're in operation at our winery, in our vineyard, in our warehouse. All of our operations are ticking along as normal. Our tasting rooms have been able to reopen per protocols, but were shuttered again over the last few weeks because of heat and smoke. But very, very happy to say after several weeks, the air is cleared here. We have beautiful blue skies and the temperatures have moderated. So our tasting rooms are back in full operation and hosting folks again. So that's excellent news. So right now, why don't we, I know the wildfires are on everyone's mind. So why don't we do a check-in on that going around our group. And David, maybe I'll ask you to start off in terms of what you've seen, and then the winemakers can maybe weigh in terms of what they're tasting in the fruit and, you know, what impact, if any, the wildfires had on the 2020 harvest.
Thanks, David. Well, like a lot of things with COVID and this year, 2020, it was pretty much unprecedented that we have wineries that are 102 miles apart, and there was fire within 2 miles of Linton Springs and 6 miles of Montebello at the same time. That's never happened. I hope before. Hopefully, it'll never happen again. A little bit hairy. There was a mandatory evacuation at Lytton for a hot minute, a day and a half or so. Thankfully, the fires never really made it down to Dry Creek proper. They were able to keep them out of the valley. At Montebello, we weren't ever really in danger of, the winds weren't strong enough to put us in danger of actually having fire at the winery. But it was still pretty devastating to all of our neighbors, and pretty smoky for a while. So that, and to add insult to injury, the fires were bookended on either side by pretty major heat waves. August 2020 is going down as the hottest August in recorded history in California. Not something that we were looking forward to at all.
No.
And so it put a quick end to harvest, in that it really ripened grapes in a hurry. And so we've been picking like crazy since I think the second week in August. We're pretty, some of the wines that have come in, John and Eric can talk to these, but the earlier pickings that we've done in, say, in Contra Costa County, that was before the fire. A couple of the Alexander Valley vineyards that we were able to get in really weren't impacted by smoke. Paso had a lot of smoke, but it was kind of like secondhand smoke. The wines seemed to be pretty good. And in between, we're still kind of waiting. It started out to be a really high acid year, and I think that's the case. Maybe I shouldn't say high acid, maybe more normal acid, whereas 2019 was a particularly low acid year. This year seems to be bounced back very nicely. So good pHs, good natural acidity in the wines, and knock on wood. I mean, I was really worried about going into harvest about COVID, and knock on wood, our crews that work for us up in Sonoma County with Four Seasons Vineyards Management have all stayed healthy, and likewise our Montebello crews. And I think that has a lot to do with everybody's diligence, especially on our for all the workers, that they take the discipline that we tried to instill in the workplace, wearing masks, social distance, or physical distancing, taking care to keep your hands washed, et cetera, et cetera. They carry that into when they go back at home, and that's really made a difference. And we're really, really thankful about that. So anyway, that's enough for me.
Yeah, that's great, David. That's a great update, and I think everybody is benefiting from your knowledge and wisdom there. So, John, maybe I'll kick it over to you and talk about some of the testing we've done before picking, and some of the results, and what you're actually tasting in the wines as they're starting to come through and beginning to ferment there at Lytton.
There we go. So yeah, I mean, we came into August and are preparing for harvest, and our main concern was COVID, like David said. And then what is different about this year is that we've had fires here 3 out of the last 4 years. And in all past fires, the fires came at the very, very end of the season of harvest. So we had all the grapes into the winery because those fires come from winds that are blowing from the east. This was different because it was started by lightning. So we'd never really experienced a fire going on during harvest. So obviously smoke became a concern, and we immediately started doing berry samples, which were sent into the local lab. And the unfortunate thing is that as you can imagine, every single winery, every single grower, not just in Sonoma County, but all over, they were sending their samples to the one lab that runs this test. So the backup just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So we had to make the choice. We didn't necessarily have the information in front of us, and we had to make a choice to pick or not. So at this point, some of the results have come back. The vast majority of them have come back with no smoke tape detected. The other thing, obviously, the other shoe that has to drop is waiting for the wines to ferment completely and then sending out a finished wine sample to see if there was anything, that we missed in testing, for example. So that's where it is. It's obviously a little bit in limbo. We have not, at this point, we haven't seen anything from the tasting point of view that smells like, smoke tank.
Good. Yes, so we still have a ways to go as we move through harvest. But the initial indications, at least from the lab testing and all of our tasting so far, has been pretty good. I think there's been maybe one vineyard that we've identified that maybe had some elevated levels, and that's certainly, we're making the commitment that's not going to end up in any of our single vineyard wines. So, and I think that's pretty much our commitment across the board, that, we're not going to compromise quality at this point in time because of any issues with smoke. That's, we've worked too long and too hard to develop our reputation to take any risk with that. So our quality standards are going to remain the same this year as they've always been. So Eric, maybe you want to talk about some of what you're experiencing with the 20 harvest relative to the fires, and also just the quality of the harvest. I mean, going in before the fires, we were looking at a super high quality harvest. Has our opinion changed on that?
No, not at all. No, if any, I mean, it's really just been a beautiful vintage. The pace of it. I mean, the fire, of course, was not ideal to have happen, in the time it did, but really did not impact a lot of the fruit out of Geyserville. And so far, everything, I mean, we've brought in basically all of Geyserville at this point. We're pressing off our last tanks today, and you taste through every single lot, and there's just this deep color, really rich flavor, no hints of anything that smoke. We've gotten back some results that have given us some good assurance that there's really nothing there. Same with all the Chardonnay, all the white Rhones, everything has come in and is either still just starting to ferment in barrel or just kind of halfway through or even finished. And I just went into the cellar this morning to taste through all the different Chardonnay lots. And again, everything looks really beautiful, excellent quality. And the very first fruit that came in before we were even thinking of fire, I mean, it was a really early start, was the Contra Costa fruit, which really kind of gave us a good insight of the type of vintage we were going to have without fruit coming in, just with incredible color, really good richness. And the fact that flavors were seeming to lead sugar. So a lot of what we've been bringing in has been coming in at relatively modest Brix levels, which it's really going to make a fantastic vintage. I mean, I see the alcohols across most everything being much on the lower side this year.
So even with that amazing heat in August, in spite of that, we're still seeing moderate alcohol.
Yeah. Well, our thing was, we saw the heat coming, we jumped on it, we started picking, and it wasn't because, the sugars were going to spike. It was more that the flavors were there. So let's not wait any longer. Let's not get caught to a point where we won't be able to pick fast enough. And so we really started bringing in a lot of fruit before that real big heat wave. And all that has really kind of fermented out to the 13% range of ripeness. So that's like half of Geyserville is in that 13. And then everything that came in after the heat wave, the sugars did jump. We did get some pretty incredible concentration in the grapes, but they weren't over the top. So in blending, I think we're going to come out right at 14 or maybe possibly just under, which hasn't happened for Geyserville since, I think, 93 vintage.
Yeah. It's been a long time.
Yeah. And yet very fully ripe, beautifully structured. I mean, it's just a really excellent year as far as what I'm seeing develop in the fermenters. Now we're just starting to get into the Bordeaux grapes here at Montebello. So we started with a couple Cab and one Merlot lot. And here I'm seeing kind of what we saw in 2001, where sugars kind of are leading flavor. So, and also it's been tricky getting really good vineyard samples. What we're sampling in the field is actually, when we actually pick and bring into the tank, they're actually under. So trying to figure that out. But hopefully over the next couple of days, as temperatures kind of moderate, maybe the vines will get into balance, and we'll get to a point where things even out a little bit more, or we get more uniform ripening, which should happen.
Terrific. So maybe we'll just wrap up with David on the 20 harvest before we start the wines and get your impressions. After some really big harvests, particularly 18, 19 in terms of tonnage, we're seeing something a little bit different this year, David, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a little bit scattered. I'd say it was looking to be an average to slightly below average year. But those heat waves really reduced the fruit levels of fruit, crop levels anyway, and in Zinfandel especially. Once it, it can take, grapes can take pretty good heat if they're acclimated to it before veraison. But once they're past veraison, especially Zinfandel, once it's over 21 bricks, it doesn't come back. Once it starts to shrivel, you've got to pick it. So that really hurt our yields on our Zin blocks in Sonoma. Montebello, the jury's still out. The Cabernet crop looks good. It'd be the second strong year in a row for Cabernet. Merlot bounced back from a low yield last year to look really solid this year. So I'm still hopeful that we'll be at normal or above normal at Montebello. So especially as the young blocks that we've been planting have come in, they're looking really good. In fact, we're picking some of the airstrip, which is 2014, 2015.
Yeah, we got a little crop on it last year. This year, probably better size crop.
Yeah,
and
so with
promising quality too.
Is it fair to say that we're seeing maybe slightly smaller berry size, a little more concentration in the fruit? Is that fair to say, David? Or
yeah, so set was really good. That's the crazy thing. So that we had a May rain, which kind of saved the vintage, saved the growing season for us, because we're at below 50% rainfall on all of our areas. That didn't even make 20 inches at Lytton Springs, or barely made 20 inches. Geyserville 17 inches, Montebello 17 inches, all half or below what we normally get. But that May rain, it did a couple things. It helped it was immediately available to the vines, so they used all that water. It kind of delayed the bloom on early blooming varieties and accelerated the bloom on the later blooming varieties. So everything basically.
Yeah, that's why we're having a compact vintage right now.
Exactly, but fairly good set, and actually quite a few seeds in the Zin berries. So they would have been big berries. The clusters weren't super big, but big berries, full set. But they just kind of lost a lot of weight with the heat. So yeah. Crazy.
I mean, that's the first time I walked through Geyserville, and the fruit looked like Montebello cab. I mean, some of the blocks, the berries were so tiny.
They weren't that small.
Oh, they were like half their normal size.
Yeah.
I like it. It's a good description.
Much more even, that's for sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. So, Eric, why don't you kick us off with the first wine? This is our second vintage of Grenache Blanc 2019 from Adelaide.
Yeah. So, the crop in 19 was down. 18 was our first year. 19's crop was down a bit. We picked it on the same day as we did in 18. So it was a cooler growing season with a half a crop. With that much hang time, it did get some really good flavor development in the berries. We picked at a reasonable bricks to ensure good acidity, which we've really come to appreciate in that site with the limestone there and the coastal influence. It gives us Grenache Blanc with some really juicy acidity. So the fruit came in, we whole cluster pressed, barreled it down to kind of 3 different fermentation vessels, some to barrel, some to stainless steel tank, and then some to concrete. And then just awaited the natural yeast fermentations, which actually took some time. It actually was kind of very slow for 19. A lot of the wines in 19 fermented really slow. This one in particular went through this really strange phase where I was pulling samples out of tank, barrel, concrete, and it was just like marmalade color, really deep orange, really almost like orange wine. It kind of oxidized and wild tasting. But then like finally, as we got to spring 2020, warmer temperatures got into the cellar, the natural yeast, reactivated, fermented with vigor, and finally took the wine to total dryness. And during that time, with all that activity, it just like drew all the color out. I mean, it went from this really dark orange to now this super pale color, and finally settled down. The malolactic finish. In fact, there wasn't a lot of malate to begin with in the Grenache, so it went really quickly. It allowed us to bottle at the end of June and really lock in that beautiful freshness of that vibrant fruit with all the citrus notes. And we were really careful on the balance of how much oak to give it. So it was really carefully controlled, relying on the stainless steel and the concrete to help moderate the oak influence. Because we really want to make this wine a really delicious, easy drinking style, without too much oak influence. So we really highlight the varietal. Now in blending this year, I did a little bit more Picpoul since we had a little bit more to work with, and a little less Roussanne, because the Roussanne, really delicious this year. I actually took some of the extra Roussanne and bottled it separately, but it was kind of oily and a little bit kind of rich and structured. So I really wanted, again, this wine to have a really nice kind of core citrus flavor. The Picpoul really helps kind of keep that definition, and just a little Roussanne to kind of help the finish, extend the finish, and give it a little bit of texture.
Yeah, it's a beautiful wine. It's always interesting when you launch a new wine. We don't launch a new wine in the national market very often. But last year when we did with the 18 vintage, it's kind of like sending your kindergartner off to school. You think you have a smart kid, but you don't really know until he shows up at school, right? But we were really happy. The wine was great. People loved it. Consumers loved it, and it sold very quickly. So we're excited to have the 19. I'm going to jump over to the chat because we're getting some questions about this wine that I wanted to pass through. And David Gaze, maybe you can talk about the clone of Grenache Blanc and vine age, and also maybe a little bit about the terroir there at Adelaida.
Yes, it's the Talbot's Creek clone for all three varieties. They're Grenache Blanc, Roussanne, and the Picpoul Blanc. They're planted in 08 and 09. It's on 1103P rootstock, which is really good for the soils there. It's basically dry farm. They have a drip system there. They'll do a little fertigation through the drip, but now that the vines are mature, they haven't really needed to irrigate, especially in 2019 when we had so much rain. In fact, they were trying to devigor their vines as much as they could. The soils there are typical, I would say, for Western Paso Robles, the Adelaida district. It's all fairly recent limestone, like 20 to 40 million years old. You find big fish or big mammal, like whale fish bones fossilized in the limestone. Nice, beautiful chunks of limestone when you get down, not too deep, especially in the hills. What's nice about this vineyard is it is up at a little bit of elevation. I think it's 12 or 1,400 feet. We have it in the tech stuff. That's we figured it out at one point. And so not a lot of topsoil, but the beauty of limestone is that vine roots love it, especially if they're lime tolerant, and they will go down in it. It holds water really well, so the vines they grow beautifully. But Great. You have to put it on a lime resistant a rootstock that tolerates high lime. That's really important. For instance, if you tried it on just pure St. George, the vines wouldn't make it. They get chlorosis and die.
So a couple of, thank you, David. That's great. And Eric, a couple of winemaking questions for you. Oh, I'll let you get back in your seat. But the questions are about Malo. How much of the wine?
My audio has gone out.
Oh, did we lose you?
Yeah, my audio.
I can hear you.
Did the usual thing, which sometimes happens with Zoom and my earbuds.
All
but
right.
you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just
right.
barely. I don't know. I'll have to see if I could turn up the volume.
Okay.
There we go.
I'm gonna throw a couple of quick questions at you.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a question about the ml in the wine, and was it naturally occurring or inoculated, and also what percentage of the wine went through, and then also what accounts for a slow versus a fast fermentation in a wine? Why does it? What are the variables there?
Yeah, well, this went through a full malolactic and with the natural. I mean, we didn't do anything to induce it, and there wasn't much malate to begin with, so we went a full 100% of the way through, just so that it was a stable wine, so we could go to bottle without having to do any, sterile filtration of it to prevent malolactic in bottle. And as far as like primary fermentation, fast or slow, I mean, I always like a slow ferment for the whites. It's all done at a very cool temperature. So I'm trying to generally, extend out a natural primary fermentation to at least 4 months. This one just seemed to continue on past that. And that probably had a lot to do with just nutrient, issues, and maybe it was a little too cold in the cellar, so that really just kept it going really slow. But eventually, as we got into the spring of 2020, we were having some good warm weather, and that seemed to do the job of getting the yeast reactivated, and they finished. And what I love about those slow, long ferments is that it stresses the yeast, and as they stress, they create a lot more essential oils, which come into the wine, and give the wine, just so much more beautiful fruit and freshness.
Great, thank you, Eric.
Yeah.
And then the last question on this wine is, and I think I'll take a shot at it, and then I'll let you guys weigh in too. But what has inspired the addition of this wine to the range? I think that not having a white wine in our fall release, it was an inspiration. We obviously had the Estate Chardonnay as part of our spring release, but not having a white in the fall. And then I think also our historic connection with Rhone varieties, whether it be Syrah, Grenache, Mataro, Petite Syrah, that having a white Rhone in the portfolio seemed to make sense for us in terms of what we have experience with and what we're interested in. And I think, David Gates, you can comment on identifying the availability of this fruit and bringing this to everyone as well, right?
Yeah, well, that one thing that I've seen, we've been long-term members of Rhone Rangers, and you get to taste a lot of wines when back before COVID, when you could have wine tastings. One thing that really stands out is that Grenache Blanc is made for California. And I would say, likewise, Picpoul Blanc. There's another one. It's not necessarily a Rhone grape, but Vermentino or Roll. I think those do just as well here, even make maybe even more complete wines on their own than they do where they actually came from. And Grenache Blanc thrives in California, anywhere in California. And so we thought if we were going to do another white wine that wasn't Chardonnay, that would be a good place to start.
Very good.
Yeah.
Good. All right. And David, we'll just keep rolling with you. Why don't we move to the first red, the 2018 Pagani, and we'll let you kick off the discussion on that wine.
Yeah, we just finished harvesting the 2020 Pagani yesterday with a little block of Alicante. And it came off as usual in a fast and furious. So we started on a Thursday with the youngest vines on the ranch last Thursday, and then picked through the weekend and finished on Wednesday, or Thursday. So another quick harvest for Pagani. We've been making the Pagani Ranch since 1991, and it's in Sonoma Valley, right off Highway 12, kind of in between Kenwood and Glen Ellen. It's a beautiful old vineyard. The back part of the vineyard that's kind of in two parcels separated by an old railroad track, an old railroad line. The back parcel is planted in the 1880s. And it's actually kind of two separate ranches in terms of farming because the soils are so different. We get some fruit from there that yielded very well this year. Likewise in 2018. So beautiful old vines that are still chugging along. The big vines that you saw in that first shot are on the eastern part of the ranch, right against Highway 12. Probably the most photographed, most painted vineyard in California, at least in Sonoma County anyway, with the Alicante vines turned bright red at harvest, just fluorescent red. And people are always taking pictures and stopping. And those vines were planted in the middle of Prohibition in 1922 for the fresh market trade for people for home winemaking back then. And they've stayed in the Pagani family ever since. So I think the Pagani family bought it just after the turn of 1900s, and they've been farming it. They used to own a winery, so this wine, the wine made from these grapes went to their own winery called Glen Ellen Winery of all things. And then when that kind of went belly up in the 50s, when they couldn't give wine away, they kept selling grapes. So it's really great that they've stayed in the family. They're fifth generation people from Pagani are involved now. They've done a really good job of keeping it going. And starting in 2011, we kind of made a partnership with them where they added some new fields that had been fallow or had been in pairs in the past. And so we have two different plantings of newer grapes where we've mixed in a little bit of Petite Syrah with it. So you'll notice on the early Paganis from the 90s and the early 2000s, it was mostly Zinfandel. Alicante is kind of always the second one here. And then sometimes a little Mataro, sometimes not. Starting in, I think, 2017 or so, or 2015, you'll see a little bit more Petite Syrah, and that percentages will creep up a little bit. So the first planting that we did is about 16 or 70% Petite Syrah. The second phase that we planted is 10% Petite Syrah, and we really like that. That really helps the wine. This is a cool area for Zin. It's typically one of the later Zin vineyards that we pick. And what that does in the wine is it always keeps this beautiful acidity. And it can be a pretty powerful wine. Like this, the 18 is pretty ripe. It's 14.9 alcohol, but it's kind of lively. It's kind of like Muhammad Ali, right? Light on his feet. This wine is like that. And the other thing that I really like about this wine is that it's Zinfandel. For lack of a better description, it's Zinfandel on the wild side. So yes, you get the raspberry and the blueberry and the currant, but there's also this zingy acidity, and there's this really nice rustic and in all the best meaning rustic quality from the Alicante that really makes it a beautiful wine, and it ages really well too. So
yeah, this wine is a rock star. I mean, it's just, and this particular vintage is really outstanding. I mean, it always has that cool climate note to it, but this year, to me, it's even more emphasized. That sort of tropical acidity is even more pronounced, and it's just more lively than normally even. And you saw the numbers on that, these reviews. It's like 3 reviews over 95 points for a Zinfandel. I mean, that's just crazy. That obviously some of the people are reacting to this wine in a very positive way. I mean, John, what do you think's going on with this 18 vintage here? It's pretty spectacular.
Well, I mean, to start with, the 18 was the yields as a general rule were a little down, so you're going to get more concentration. And it's not. It's funny. It's one of the last Zinfandels, if not the last Zinfandel, to come in every year, because it's in this little cool amphitheater. But it's a very difficult vineyard to pick in terms of gauging ripeness, because it's always 2, 3, 4, 5 bricks behind any Zinfandel we have, and it kind of comes up to like 21 bricks, and it just sits there. And so you take your mind off of it. And then all of a sudden, they'll get a little bit of heat, and you have to be ready to get in there, immediately. Yeah. And I think we really hit it on the nail in 2018. So,
yeah, that's my sense too, John, is that in some years that it just gets maybe a tad riper than you'd like, and you lose some of that really amazing cool climate freshness. But this year it was spot on, totally captured. We have a question, and David mentioned this too, is that we're starting to incorporate young vine fruit into this older vine vineyard. And what impact from a winemaking and profile perspective has the addition of this young fruit made to the wine over the last few years? John?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was directed to David.
No.
Yeah, so I would say the most, obviously they're young vines, but Dino Amentite, who is the Pagani family member who farms the vineyard, is an excellent farmer. And he really, he knows how to go in and drop just the right amount of crop so that we really get a concentrated wine. The other thing, which I think is really important, is that when the young vines were planted, David, at David's suggestion, we added the one out of every, David will correct me, but every 8th vine is Petite Syrah. And so obviously 1/8 of the vineyard is Petite Syrah. And I think that's really helped a lot, especially because it takes the pressure off of wanting to incorporate more Alicante, because Alicante is, you have to be careful with it, I find, because it has a real, like almost a Concord quality to it, and it could kind of make it grapey and take away from the complexity. So that's we've displaced some of the Alicante with Petite Syrah.
Interesting. Good. All right. Thank you, John. And why don't we keep rolling and move to the 18 Lytton Springs and talk a little bit about that wine.
Sure. Again, what was happening down in Sonoma Valley was happening in Dry Creek Valley as well. Some lower yields, great concentration. For me, 2018 in a way reminds me a lot of 2009, which is one of those vintages, I sort of describe it, it's one of those vintages where it's more important to recognize how balanced the fruit is coming in terms of pH, in terms of ripeness. And in more instances than not, it's that recognition that allows you to just kind of say, all right, we're going to get out of the way on this one. We're not going to get too, we're not going to put too many fingers in the pie. We're going to let the wine make itself more this year. And that was kind of what 2018 was. Extraction was beautiful across all varietals, whether it was the field blends here at Lytton East or the pure Petite Syrah blocks and going into the Zinfandel. So great concentration without, and still balanced in terms of the amount of tannin and the way the tannin incorporates into the rest of the wine. You really get that. You get a full, rich, structured wine, and yet there's this, I think, this sort of sumptuousness at the same time to the wine. So, beautiful fruit makes beautiful wine.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to try these different single vineyard Zins side by side, and you can really see the personality of Lytton stand out here versus Pagani. More structure, more tannin, less fruit notes, more earthy notes, more meatiness to the wine. This is really a beautiful example of Lytton Springs that I think any of us would be able to pick out blind. It really does capture the character of the vineyard, John.
Yeah, and I think it's also a wine that's going to, really develop over a long time. And it strikes me also as one of those wines which, in a way, sometimes the fruit actually comes out more after 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So I think it's really going to be a great wine for the cellar.
So we've got a question, John, for you about, Lytton and maybe some of our other wines. The question is, do we purposely keep the blend for Zinfandel under 75%, or how are our blending decisions made when it comes to Lytton and some of our other single vineyard Zins?
When it comes to Lytton Springs, we make we don't dial in some number arbitrarily. It's affected obviously by a given vintage. We have a couple of single blocks, for example, of Carignan, of Petite Syrah. If we get, a low crop in Carignan, there might be less Carignan available. That affects the proportions. But really, it's about, it's the way that we make all of our single vineyard wines, which is that we pick each parcel as it becomes ripe. So now we have this panel of 30, 32 cuvées, if you will, all from the same vineyard. And then it's a question of really, in any given vintage, tasting them blind, selecting out the most intense lots, and then putting that blend together. And the percentages really just fall where they fall. But obviously, since you're dealing with, the same vineyard, you're not going to see violent swings from, 45% Zin up to 80.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, John. And Eric, maybe can you just talk about the 2018 vintage generally as it applies to Zinfandel and maybe some of the other varieties?
Yeah.
What are the characteristics of that vintage?
Oh, really great balance, really sensuous palates, complexity, ageability. I mean, it's like John was saying, just, our job in winemaking was really easy. It was just guiding the transformation, watching over the extraction, but it basically was the vintage and the vineyards that made the wine. It was just really one of those ideal growing seasons of not so much rain. I mean, it was kind of a mini drought year, but enough to get the vines through the dry summer. We didn't have heat waves at all in the month of August, so we didn't have heat spikes. So everything just got the hang time, got the maturity, phenolic ripeness, flavor development, and it just made these really sumptuous Zinfandels. And I saw the same thing with Montebello fruit, the Bordeaux varieties, Chardonnay. I mean, it's an outstanding vintage for Chardonnay. Again, when you don't get those heat waves in a period of time just before you harvest, it just keeps the vines really relaxed and cruising towards harvest with really good flavor development. So I love our 18s. I mean, every single wine we made has just turned out so good, including Three Valleys, I mean, which is then kind of the offshoot of what's left over of all the single vineyard Zins. That came together so beautifully.
Yeah, we're almost sold out of that.
I know.
That wine, so
Yeah.
I think people are liking that apparently.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Eric. So, John, why don't we move to the fourth wine, the Petite Syrah. It's a varietal that Ridge has worked with for a long time, either as part of a blend with our Old Vine Zins or even up at York Creek up in Spring Mountain. But I think we really feel that here in Dry Creek at the Lytton Vineyard, this is really an awesome place to make Petite Syrah. And so what's been your experience with the making of Petite here at Lytton?
Ridge has a long history of Petite Syrah, obviously going all the way back to the very early 70s with York Creek. So we had, obviously we had a lot of experience working with the varietal over time. And, in the early 2000s, in 2002, 2003, we said, we have a lot of Petite Syrah here in Dry Creek at our Lytton Vineyard. Let's plant a couple of pure petite lots. And we made a little bit of wine in 2002, 2003, and we're really impressed with the results. So we started to really focus in on what are some of the better spots where we can start planting some pure Petite Syrah. And most of those happened over our Lytton West Vineyard. It's a vineyard where you have lots of parcels with a high clay content, and Petite seems to do really, really well in those spots. And in fact, what we were noticing is that some of those spots, Petite would perform better than actually Zinfandel would. So we started shifting those areas over to Petite Syrah. And 2009, I believe, was our first national release of the Lytton Estate Petite Syrah. It was really well accepted, and we just kept going from there. one of the great things about the varietal is that when you're in a warm to hot climate like Dry Creek Valley, it's not quite like Carignan. I mean, Carignan really can ripen at a much lower sugar, but Petite certainly, at least here at Lytton West, will get ripe. You'll have beautiful ripeness at fairly lower sugars, and that means you're still retaining that great acidity. So most frequently, the Lytton Estate Petite Syrah will either come in under 14% or just slightly over.
Yeah. David, you want to comment on growing Petite Syrah at Lytton, and how is it different from growing Zinfandel there, and what's your experience been with the variety?
So Petite Syrah, it's actually fun to grow. It doesn't get mildew, it doesn't rot as badly as Zinfandel. The clusters can still be quite tight, and it has a genetic thing going on where it's called fasciation, where the shoots will split, they kind of double up, and the clusters will do the same thing. So sometimes you can get these, I call them hammerhead clusters. They're like monsters. They're 2 pounds each. So you have to be very judicious in your thinning, especially when the vines are young. Its Achilles heel is that it gets wood disease. It gets wood disease like Eutypo or bot canker. Gets it worse than Cabernet Sauvignon, which puts it right up there, or Petit Verdot. Those are 2 other varieties that get it very badly. So the vines don't live very long. It's really hard to find a 50-year-old Petite Syrah vine in any of the historic vineyards around California. But as far as growing it, it does take a little bit. It's not a vigorous grower. I think that for me, that's why why it was called Petite Syrah back in the day, back in the 1880s or 90s when it became popular in California. Other than that, it's pretty easy. It will sunburn, like Carignan. It'll sunburn when it's still green. Once it's into veraison, it won't. It's pretty resistant to it. Zinfandel is kind of the opposite of that. So it's pretty easy. And what I also love about it is that John likes it, and Eric too. They like it at lower bricks. So in any given vintage, it'll ripen about the same as Zin. Sometimes it's a little bit behind, but it doesn't scream up in sugar like Zinfandel will do. So it's great for that, and it really can help. It fills the mid palate of the wine. It helps the finish of Zinfandel, and it also helps moderate alcohol. Adds color, all that stuff. It's great.
Yeah. Does it not ripen as quickly as Zin because of the thicker skin? Is that what accounts for that, David, or are there other issues?
I think that is part of it, because it does have really chewy skins, and typically if you look at the fruit to shoot ratio on it, it's usually a little bit higher. There's more fruit than leaves versus Zinfandel, which has a lot bigger leaves. That has something to do with it. But yes, I think the thicker skins, it makes a big difference on that.
And John, just lastly on the winemaking, I mean, a couple of years ago, I think it was on the back label or on our tasting notes, you said it was kind of like taming Godzilla making Petite Syrah. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of working with this particular grape variety to make sure you make a wine that's accessible and drinkable without having to wait 25 years?
Sure. The great thing about Petite Syrah is it has enormous color and tannin. The bad thing about Petite Syrah is that it has enormous color and tannin. So you have to be aware of that, because the first time you see Petite Syrah that's macerating in a tank, it takes everyone by surprise. I mean, it's black as coal, and there is a lot of tannin, and pretty much always there's more tannin there than the wine really can handle if you're aiming for a balanced wine that isn't going to be over tannic. So being able to taste, knowing the vineyards, and also, one of the difficult things about tasting wine when it's still fermenting is that it's sweet. So you have to kind of factor that in. If you're really starting to feel the tannins through all that sugar, it's probably time to start thinking about pulling it off the skins. So that's really the trick, if you will. Fortunately, we have a number of different blocks. So, if you have one, maybe you miss that one, it's a little over tannic, then you pull back on another one and feel your way.
Okay. Yeah, Wilford Wong is in the audience from wine.com. He's peppering us with good questions here. So I'm going to throw one more at you, John. And the question is about, do we make the Lytton Estate Petite Syrah the same way we have made in the past the York Creek Petite Syrah, or are we following any different protocols between the two wines based upon, appellation and terroir?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we'd need Paul Draper here to comment. If you go back into the 70s, early 80s, maybe David might know a little bit more about some of the 80s wines. But, the only difference I suspect is that we use a lot more whole berry now in Petite Syrah. So instead of, you're de-stemming it, but it's not going through the rollers where you crush that, you're crushing the grapes. And that helps to preserve the fruit a little bit more, again, which gives you a little bit of a cushion on the tannins. But that would be the only thing I can think of in terms of the differences in winemaking.
Or some whole cluster. We used to do that with some of the York Creek. And that's like another way to really soften the tannins.
Mm-hmm.
And do you do much of that, or have you experimented with the whole cluster with the Lytton Estate, John?
I've experimented with it a bit. The thing with Petite Syrah is, again, unless you're willing to sacrifice and get some pretty elevated sugars, you have very, very green stems, and that's the challenge with whole cluster.
Yeah. But it would work at Spring Mountain just because it was kind of a higher elevation, longer
hang time
season. So you get some years you get those nice brown stems, and it would work out beautifully.
Yep.
Yeah.
But still, Eric, those York Creek wines, especially.
I found some in my cellar I haven't touched in like 20 years. And
and that's what you had to do. You had to lay them down for a long time.
And they were some of the most painful assemblages to go through. I mean, they were seriously tannic. Whereas, Lytton Estate, there's something really unique. It's definitely the soil, the warmth of Dry Creek Valley. It makes the tannins just so much more sensuous, more velvety, and it's like big tannin numbers, but it's really got a lot of fruit to go around the tannins to make it really approachable in a way.
Good. All right. Well, thanks, John, for talking us through that wine. And Eric, why don't we move to our cleanup hitter here, the 17 Montebello, and talk a little bit maybe about the vintage and what happened in 17 with Montebello.
Well, 17 was that year we finally got some good rainfall. After the 5-year drought, 17 came along and we ended up with like 250% of normal rain. That's when Montebello Road washed out. There's mudslides. It was just calamity through the mountains. But, with that water getting to the vines, they kind of finally reinvigorated them in 17. Now, because of the drought of 5 years, they didn't have the energy to put out a big crop. So the yields were kind of modest in 17. We had really good heat that summer. And right around Labor Day, we had, just like this year's Labor Day, just this blast of heat. 106 degrees here at Montebello on that day. And with that heat, luckily the vines had the water in the ground. They got through it and, ripened slowly. We did start picking a little bit earlier that year. We finished the vintage early and got really great concentration. I mean, the berries were small, you know, loaded with color, really rich tannins. I stayed on the skins a little bit longer that year just because the ferments were kind of on a slower pace. I really wanted to make sure that they were a little bit more finished before pressing off. But it really created a wine with some really great weight, really good ageable tannins. In blending, I mean, it's kind of the typical blend of what we have been putting out, you know, low 70% cab, you know, second variety is Merlot, third is Petit Verdot, and fourth is Franc. So kind of a classic blend of what you've seen in Montebello, you know, really in the last like 10, 15 years. And the assemblage process, as John was kind of describing for the Zins, we do the same here at Montebello. All the vineyard parcels are picked as they're deemed ready by taste. They come up, ferment in small tanks. We do whole berry because that's really at the heart of really containing and managing the tannins. So in the fermenters, the whole berries are collected, the natural yeast then start. And as the fermentation activity kicks up and gets more vigor, we do really good aerative pump overs. You know, providing oxygen to the juice really helps kind of soften, rounds out the edges of the tannin. It keeps the natural yeast also fed with oxygen to keep them happy and healthy and fermenting. And we'll do that generally twice a day, but as it's fermenting and as we're extracting, I'm really cautious about tasting and adapting to the vintage. So if it's a high tannin year, we really start to taper off and really reduce the amount of pump over time, or the amount of juice going through the skins, because as you really start to see a lot of tannins extracting, you've got to moderate and start cutting back. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a wine that's just so massively tannic that it'll take decades before it's ready to drink. So in 17, we really started tapering off the pump overs to really try to extend out the fermentation time. And there was actually several days where we weren't actively pumping the juice through the skin. We were actually going under the cap with a stainless steel tube going through the skins to just really basically aerate and circulate the juice below. And then what I like to do right before we're ready to press, and as we're closer to dry, where you don't have the sugar coating the tannins, you can actually really see the structure of the wine. And right before press, we can do one last quick pump over to really flesh out and fill out the body of the wine, and then drain off and press. And, you know, since really 1996, we've really learned that fractionation of the press is essential. So we'll load the press with the fermented skins and we'll let it drip, and we'll capture that fraction of really the loosely bound wine. And then we'll turn on the press. It's a pneumatic press, so we'll slightly inflate the membrane, squeeze very lightly against the skins, and capture what we call first squeeze. And then over time, just increase the amount of pressure and pull off 2 more press fractions and collect that all in a tank, taste after the press cycle's done, and right at the spot decide to add or not. And in 17, I really couldn't add much more press wine because the wines were already so well defined. So we kept most of that out. And yet it's still really quite strong and well structured, you know, being mostly free run.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you know, I was just thinking to myself as I was tasting this wine, is that you can get so blasé. I taste the wine and I go, another great vintage of Montebello. You know, it's like it's hard to take it for granted, which is so silly, because this is, you know, we're talking about, you know, 60 years of experience in one of the greatest vineyards in the world, and you know, if you put that all together, you kind of start to expect greatness, and that's what we have in the glass here again. But you know, we have to remind ourselves not to be blasé about this, and unfortunately we have another short vintage here where we just don't have good supply of this wine through the U.S. market, which is you know, painful. I understand, and I apologize for that to some extent. But David, maybe I'll ask you to talk about plantings at Montebello and talk about the sunny side of the future about Montebello and about where we're going and where we're at and when we can start to expect some of this new fruit to either show up in Montebello or in Estate Cabernet.
Yeah, so the last 10 years we've been, or 13 years we've been busy. So the Rooston Ranch, which is, you know, about a third of the way up the hill, has we have phase 3 on that. That's 8.5 acres that's in production, and it will really begin to ramp up in the next couple of years. Here at the Peroni Vineyard by the Upper Winery, our production facility, we did a 9.5 acre block called the Upper Gate Block. It's an extension. It was part of the Mid-Peninsula open space deal where we did a lot line adjustment and got a little bit of land that had vines on it before Prohibition. And then we did a lease easement swap where we gave up our developmental rights on vineyard land for planting rights or agricultural rights on more land of open space, private or publicly held land that had vineyards on it before. So so that 9.5 acres is part of that. We're developing another 7.5 acres this year. We're clearing the land. We'll plant next year. That's phase 2 of the open space. And in between that, we planted another acre of Chardonnay down at Rooston and 2.5 acres of an old replant for water take block. And that went into Merlot. So we're busy.
And that first 9.5 acres, David and Eric, when do you think we're going to start seeing some fruit off of that?
Next year.
Yeah, I'll get a little bit next year, and then
You'll get 15 tons next year, Eric.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, the more the better. I mean, this is just, I mean, in all the young vines that have been planted in the recent years, I mean, it's really in the sweet spot of this mountain, elevation-wise, exposure to the ocean, limestone. I mean, it really has the potential to immediately give us Montebello quality. But until it's in the fermenter, fermented out, and at the table as we're doing the assemblage, we really don't know. So we plant with the best intention that it's going to work out for making more Montebello, but you know, it's young vines. I mean, we really just don't know until, you know, they get some age on them and get their roots down. You know, they have to begin to show some of the vineyard personality in the wine. Otherwise, until that point, it's going to go into the estate cab, which means then I got to ferment it more carefully. So a lot of these new blocks that I'm working with, it's really, I have to study them really closely right now because they're at that transition point where they are old enough where they could potentially go into Montebello. So I have to really dig deep into their flavors and their complexity to see in the fermenter, do they really have all the elements of a great Montebello? And if they do, then I will work the skins a little bit harder, extract, and really make sure that they will come to the table as we taste all the ingredients for Montebello to be able to fit into the blend.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think we just crossed over the 1 hour mark, so I want to honor that as best we can. So I want to thank our audience for joining us today. I know it's been a rough year, 2020. I know all of us here have had to deal with COVID and smoke and heat and fires, and it's been tough here, but we're persevering. I know it's been tough for all of you with restaurant closures and everything else going on in the business world out there in terms of the restrictions on our economy. So just wishing you all the best, wishing you all a very happy, healthy, and strong fourth quarter. Again, thanks for joining us today. Hopefully we'll see you in the spring, and hopefully we'll under much different circumstances with our next virtual tasting. And a big thank you to our panel, David Gates, Eric Baugher, John Olney. Thank you for all of your great insights today. And thanks again, and have a great weekend. And we'll be hopefully seeing you all in person soon. Thank you very much.
Cheers.